Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Depot Dive. I'm Ross McCorkle, and above me on the screen is Joe Clark, and I literally just got back last night, late. I think I walked in the door at 1 a.m. Last night, back from vacation, and so I have a lot of catching up to do. Apparently, I chose the busiest off-season week of the schedule this year to go on my vacation, and so a lot of this is just going to be Joe catching me up on everything. We'll give our opinions along the way. We're going to talk about the Jalen Ramsey, Jonnu Smith, Minkah Fitzpatrick trade that went down I think that was about a day after I left for my trip. Aaron Rodgers had his teammates in, several of them at least, to Malibu for a workout. We'll talk about that, and then there's some Mike Tomlin stuff from James Harrison, from Aditi Kinkhabwala, some stuff that was said about Tomlin that has been a topic of discussion this week. So we'll talk about all of that and wrap up the show with a listener question. Joe, how was everything? I think I was out. I think Scott, one of our main editor, was out. Was a little hectic.
Yeah, last Monday was certainly quite hectic. Waking up about a half hour after I got on, the Jalen Ramsey trade dropped kind of out of nowhere because the week before, every major insider said, "Yeah, Jalen Ramsey's not going to the Steelers," and sure enough, Jalen Ramsey went to the Steelers. And then every major insider said, "Well, it seemed like the Steelers were the only logical destination for Jalen Ramsey." So yeah, we kept the receipts, Adam Schefter, but yeah, it was pretty hectic, but definitely an interesting week for sure to see the Steelers continue to kind of make some major moves here as they look to compete in 2025.
Yeah, I think the one thing that we've learned from the Steelers in general, this offseason in particular, but the last couple or last few with Omar Khan at the helm, is that nobody really has a totally accurate pulse on what's going on behind closed doors in the Steelers' kind of decision-making process. Because at the draft you had the national media saying the quarterbacks were going to get drafted in the first. The local media ended up being right on that one, but I mean, along the way, Aaron Rodgers was one that the local media missed on. And this stuff, certainly, Ramsey, I think local and national kind of missed on. So it's just been an unpredictable offseason for the Steelers top to bottom, and this was the latest move in a long string of them. I mean, George Pickens trade, the Aaron Rodgers signing. I'm probably missing some others. This Minkah Fitzpatrick. The DK Metcalf trade, giving him the biggest contract in team history until TJ Watt takes that away here, hopefully pretty soon. But yeah, it's been unpredictable every step of the way, and I think this Jalen Ramsey, Jonnu Smith, I mean, let me ask you this to start off. Which of those two players are you more excited about?
It's a tough question. I've thought about it a lot, but I think would probably go with Jonnu Smith just because the Steelers secondary, even with if Minkah Fitzpatrick was there instead of Jalen Ramsey, I think Jalen Ramsey gives them an upgrade because it's another, it's a better cornerback, and obviously Minkah Fitzpatrick kind of lacked the splash over the last 2 years, but the receiver room and the tight end room was strong with Darnell Washington, but in terms of pass catching weapons, there was still a void there. And I think Smith gives you another pass catching weapon, and he also strengthens your tight end room where when the Steelers run 13 personnel, they're going to be a lot more effective now. They can, they have Jonnu Smith there in addition to Darnell Washington and Pat Freiermuth. I think he raises the ceiling for the offense more than Jalen Ramsey without Minkah Fitzpatrick raises the ceiling for the defense. So even though Ramsey's the bigger name of the trade, I do think that the Smith addition is one that will really has the potential to be more beneficial for the Steelers in 2025.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at every single team's tight end room, but I'd be surprised if there was one that was better than the Steelers at this point, top to bottom, and just in terms of diverse skill sets and in terms of receiving capabilities and I mean, yards after the catch with Jonnu. You got kind of possession and just moving the chains with a guy like Pat Freiermuth, and Darnell Washington can do a little bit of everything. I think we're all hoping he takes that next step as a receiver. And so to me, I look at this move of getting this strong of a tight end room, and you get Arthur Smith in the picture, who is a tight end guru. He was a tight end coach at one point in time, and he likes using, 12, 13, even 14 personnel more than just about anybody else in the league. So is this kind of another indication that the Steelers are all in on Arthur Smith.
I think so. I mean, it's a guy that Arthur Smith has been connected to. He's coached at two different stops, and I think it's a sign that it's a guy that not only will help out Aaron Rodgers, but it's a guy that will help Arthur Smith kind of execute what he wants to do on offense. So I don't think Arthur Smith is going anywhere unless he leaves for a head coaching job. And I think the Steelers, I mean, even drafting Caleb Johnson, a guy who ran the zone predominantly in college, same scheme that Arthur Smith likes to run. I think the Steelers this offseason have kind of done a good job getting guys that fit his scheme instead of trying to make him, fit guys into his scheme that aren't used to playing the way he wants to play. So I do think it is a sign that they're very happy with Arthur Smith as an offense coordinator and are kind of trying to build the roster the way that he can be the most effective.
Yeah, and the Steelers give 3-year contracts to coordinators and GMs and head coaches and all of that usually. So we can assume he's probably under contract here through the 2026 season. And so, yeah, if he doesn't leave this offseason, I mean, if the Steelers do phenomenal, Aaron Rodgers has a MVP season, then maybe he probably does get a head coach look. He got a couple of them this offseason, and so he could potentially leave, but it sure made it sound like he was only going to leave for the right opportunity. He had that UNC job pretty much if he wanted it, even over Bill Belichick, according to some reports. And so I think he's here to stay, and I think the Steelers are making sure that he wants to stay by giving him all the toys that he wants to play with. I mean, even Jonnu Smith is one example, but you have Caleb Johnson, who Arthur Smith came out and did the post-draft pick kind of rundown on him and immediately called him a perfect fit for his style of offense, talked about how he had to stray from his kind of bread and butter last year in the running game with the outside zone, and now they're able to come back to that. They're able to come back to actually having success out of the 13 and multi-tight end kind of sets. And so, yeah, I think I look at this as, all right, well, they're all in on Arthur Smith for better or for worse. And I think there's probably some fans after last year that aren't thrilled about that idea, but I think the best is still yet to come for Arthur Smith and Pittsburgh, at least I hope. So let me ask you this now about the secondary. Minkah Fitzpatrick, just the trade in general, actually. Who won the trade if you had to give it a binary, Dolphins, Pittsburgh? I guess you could go with a push if you want to be boring.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Steelers won the trade because I think getting Jonnu Smith kind of pushes it over the top. There's a 2-round difference in draft picks in the 2027 draft that's kind of negligible at this point. I mean, I was initially really bummed when I saw that the return was Minkah, but that was also when it looked like it was just Minkah straight up for Ramsey before the Jonnu Smith aspect was reported. Um, I don't necessarily love the idea of trading Minkah Fitzpatrick at this point. I do think that, he still has some good football left, but Jalen Ramsey has had more consistent ball production. He gives the Steelers a strong top 3 cornerback room, and the report yesterday that Darius Slay has a knee concern, it gives them a little bit more, some more depth. You have Brendan Eccles, you have Corey Trice Jr., but now if something does happen with Slay, well, you have Jalen Ramsey and Joey Porter Jr. still as your 2 top outside corners. So it gives you a little bit of protection in terms of injury. So I do like that aspect of it, and I do think because of that, I mean, the Steelers did win the trade. I think Jalen Ramsey is still a talented cornerback in this league. He maybe isn't as good as he once was, but he gives him some versatility because he can play a little bit outside. He can play a little bit in the slot. He can play a little bit at safety. He can do a little bit all over the field. And I think kind of adding that versatility to this defense help them kind of counter, different opponents, different weeks, and he can do something a little bit different. So I've grown on his addition even with Minkah gone, and so I think the Steelers did win the trade.
So if it was outright Ramsey for Minkah,
It would be, I think initially I would say the Steelers lost, and now I would go with a push,
okay.
just because of the different things that Ramsey can kind of allow you to do.
Yeah, and I don't think either really had their best season last year, so you're kind of, I think both sides are just kind of betting on, all right, well, Minkah should be able to bounce back, and on the Steelers' end, Ramsey should be able to bounce back, and maybe both will be right. Maybe it'll work out for both ends there, and I think that's a fairly decent chance for that to happen. Pro Football Focus has the Steelers secondary ranked as 16th as of this morning. Called it a massive void left by Minkah Fitzpatrick. 16th to me feels very low. I don't know where you're at, but I look at this secondary as, I mean, just in terms of name value, which isn't everything, obviously, but Darius Slay, Jalen Ramsey, Joey Porter Jr., one of the good, rising young talents in the league. Uh, I mean, obviously losing Minkah Fitzpatrick hurts, but I think Deshaun Elliott had his best season of his career last year, and obviously the big question mark is what's going to happen at the second safety spot. Joe, has there been any indication? And this is something that I probably have just missed, but is Ramsey going to be used as corner? Are they going to just use him? Is he going to be a safety? I think I saw somebody say he's not going to be a safety. Where's
Yeah, so right after the trade came out, Mark Cabali put out that they view him as a versatile piece that can play a little bit of everywhere. Ray Fittipaldo said, I believe on Friday, yeah, that Ramsey is capable of playing safety and he might play some safety for the Steelers. But there's been no real hard and fast reporting on this. Is definitely what's going to happen. So I think we'll see when the Steelers get to the Trobe. I think it's probably going to be a mix of Ramsey can do a little bit of everything and plays a little bit everywhere. I'd be surprised if he came in and was, immediately the full time safety because I do think they like him as a corner and he reportedly views himself as more of a cornerback. So, but I think they can move him around, and I think that's kind of a nice thing to have for this defense.
Yeah, it looks like I'm just pulling up something that Matthew wrote on. I guess that would have been Friday potentially, or maybe it was Saturday. But Ramsey expressed the desire to kind of end his career at safety. And so, yeah, maybe he does play more corner this year, but if he sticks around in Pittsburgh for a little bit, maybe they do kind of transition him to safety. And I mean, Deshaun Elliott's locked up long term, but I think we were all still thinking, even with Minkah Fitzpatrick in the picture this year, we weren't sure what was going to happen next year because there's no guarantees. He had kind of a high cap hit next year, kind of likely to move on, in my opinion, from him next year, anyways, unless he had a big bounce back year. And so I think maybe this kind of fills the question at safety, and the Steelers aren't going to have to invest in that position moving forward, at least in the short term. So definitely one of the most interesting things to me to watch at training camp is who's lining up where, and is Beanie Bishop still? I mean, who's the starting slot? Who's starting safety opposite Deshaun Elliott? Who are the starting outside corners? I mean, is that a given that it's who sits in your opinion right now? If you had to who's the starters? You can only have two.
Out of the outside corner, I would say Slade is probably the guy who sits right now. I think you'd go with Porter and Ramsey outside. Um, I mean, I think maybe Ramsey starts initially in the slot, but I don't even know if that would be the case. So, but if they had picking two starting outside corners, I think it would be Porter and Ramsey right now with Slay as the third guy.
And you gave him $10 million this year for 1 year, and I mean he came to Pittsburgh because he wanted to compete. And I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit later in the show, but is this going to be another example of a player being made promises that can't be kept? I think Mike Tomlin. We'll get into that stuff a little bit later, but yeah, crazy trade. I mean, I had to look at my phone like 7 times when I was on the beach. Just like, what is this? Is this a fake Facebook headline? What am I looking at? And I think everybody pretty much shocked completely by this trade. So, is there anything else we didn't cover in that? Oh, Jalen Ramsey, you're gonna have to fill me in on this being late to practice. Apparently,
Yeah, there was a report by a columnist in not Houston, in Miami, that basically said that the Dolphins are better off not having Jalen Ramsey the person. He had, the culture in Miami with him wasn't very good. Him and Tyreek Hill reportedly really liked to practice, and he tried to undermine Mike McDaniel. So obviously not great things to hear, but I think, with Mike Tomlin in Pittsburgh, that's somebody that he's going to respect. I don't really think that it's going to be too big of an issue, but it's something to note. If things go sideways, how's Ramsey going to act? Is he going to be a locker room cancer? I think ultimately it's kind of overblown, but it's something to at least monitor and note.
yeah, Ramsey's always had a reputation, I guess, that's followed him throughout the league, and some of that's earned, some of that's probably overblown, and I guess we'll just have to evaluate that for ourselves. Mike Tomlin certainly done a good job over the years of kind of containing some of that. Some people will push back on that with like Pickens and whatever, but I think in general, Mike Tomlin is one of the best at kind of covering up some of those types of issues. So we'll have to see. He certainly seemed excited. He announced the move himself on social media with like a hype video and stuff. So he seems excited to be going where he's going, and so that's at least half the battle. If he got shipped somewhere where he didn't want to go, maybe a different story. But I think that's all for this topic for now. I'm sure we'll talk about it a lot more leading up to training camp and throughout training camp even. So I want to talk about the Malibu workout. Aaron Rodgers said during minicamp that he would be having some of his teammates out to Malibu. I think he had kind of right after he signed made a promise to the team that he was all in. And what has he done since then? He had his kind of own workouts that he was doing over there at, what is it called? Proactive Sports Performance. So he's doing that on the side. He's having his teammates in for this. I think there was a report that he was going to be meeting with Arthur Smith to go over the finer details of the offense one-on-one at some point this summer before training camp. And so he's made good on his promise to kind of go all in. And this is the latest. Who was all there in Malibu, Joe? And was anyone notable missing?
Yeah, so Ben Skoranek, Scotty Miller, Roman Wilson, DK Metcalf, Calvin Austin, and Pat Freiermuth are all there. I mean, I guess the only people that could be considered notable missing were Robert Woods. But at this point in his career, I mean, Robert Woods is established. I don't think there's going to be too much of an issue with him and Aaron Rodgers developing some sort of chemistry. Darnell Washington wasn't there, but he did post he was last week of him working out on his own. And then Connor Hayward wasn't there. Nobody really, you'd be like, wow, that guy wasn't there. I think Connor Hayward is understandable on the roster bubble. I don't think him showing up or not showing up makes too big of a difference. Darnell Washington, he's not necessarily one of the Steelers' primary pass catchers, but he's a guy that could improve, and Aaron Rodgers did compare him to Mercedes Lewis. And then, yeah, Robert Woods, he's getting stuff done on his own. He's a good blocker, good run defender. I don't think he's going to be, an 800, 900 yard receiver this year, but definitely a good turnout for sure from the Steelers receivers.
Yeah, I would have liked to have seen Darnell there. I kind of get the sense just from maybe some of his offseason interviews last year, like returning to training camp. It seems like he's kind of a family guy who I think he has a young kid or two who he probably likes to stick as close to them as possible throughout the offseason, get his work done in private. So, but I would have loved to have seen him there because I think there is potential for him to be a big piece of the puzzle, especially in the red zone this season. So I will add the quarterbacks because I think last year Russell Wilson did invite all of the quarterbacks. I think Justin Fields was there, Kyle Allen, was Plumlee there even? I don't know, but at least the first two I said were there. So to me, I guess somewhat notable just because Aaron Rodgers had kind of promised to pass on all he had learned and stuff to the younger guys, and there was kind of that narrative forming of like, oh, he's in this mentor relationship with the Will Howard, and maybe Will Howard was invited and he had some other stuff going on, or maybe not. I mean, but to me, that is at least somewhat notable. I think it would have been interesting at least to have somebody like Howard involved, but then you need to get Rudolph, and then maybe you need to also get Skylar Thompson, and then it just becomes kind of a bigger thing. So anyway. Is there anything else from that? I think there was some group bonding outside of football, and so you kind of get the sense that Rodgers is one of the guys. I think that's kind of been reported along the way, but I think there had been some media narratives that he's kind of transcends I don't know, he's either too old to relate to some of the players or whatever the media was trying to push. It seems like he had no problem doing that.
Yeah, no, he was playing basketball with Ben Skoranek. Calvin Austin posted a picture that implied that they were at Nobu. So if the group goes there, and hopefully Rogers is picking up the bill, he's made more than enough money throughout his career. But yeah, it seemed like a good group bonding experience. At least like whenever somebody posted, all of the other guys that were there were in the comment sections of their Instagram posts and hyping them up. So not only bonding with Rogers, but bonding with each other just seemed like a good time for the group that was there.
Yeah, Aaron Rodgers over almost 400 million, I think, in his career earnings. I hope he's picking up that Nobu bill. He in this discount contract that he's making with the Steelers, he's making more than most of those guys have made in their entire NFL careers so far. So I would certainly hope so. But yeah, I don't think that there's much else to really talk about there. I like the chemistry building. I like the just team bonding. I think that's a big part of training camp as well at St. Vincent. And so kind of getting the ice broken with some of his teammates, if you will, in Malibu is only a good thing, so they can hit the ground running at training camp on and off the field, both equally as important. So moving on to our third topic. This one is kind of interesting, and it started with a James Harrison comment, I believe. I think that's kind of what got this whole topic started in the first place. James Harrison, gosh, what podcast was he on? He was on Nightcap, co-hosting Nightcap as a guest co-host. I don't really know what the deal was there. Not usually the host of that show, but he was with TJ Hushmanzada, and they were talking about Mike Tomlin, and James Harrison basically said the best and worst part, I'm paraphrasing here, so this isn't a direct quote, but he was basically describing the best and worst part of Mike Tomlin being the fact that he's a player's coach, and he talked about he kind of pivoted pretty quickly to then talking about some promises that were made to him towards the end of his time in Pittsburgh that may or may not have been kept. He just kind of wished that it was told to him like it was, so he wasn't expecting one thing and getting another. And so, to me, that I don't know how he's tying that into the whole players coach thing, but that was his criticism. Is sometimes Mike Tomlin lets certain players get away with things, and maybe different players have different kind of scales or different rule sets applied to them, and certainly that's probably true. That's probably true everywhere. But this then morphed into a whole other conversation from Aditi Kinkhabwala on 93.7 The Fan last week. And Joe, if you want to fill me in there.
Yeah, so she was just kind of asked, and I think it was about the Harrison comments, actually. She was on for a full hour on Thursday, so plenty of stuff to cover. And she said, I'll just say this without violating anybody's trust. There are many, many, many former players that I've spoken to that have bitten their tongues about their experience with Mike. And so that article obviously did very well on the site, but and Josh did a good job mentioning it in his article. I think you really have to consider the source here. We hear from so many former Steelers players. Everybody has a podcast. Everybody's on a podcast. And James Harrison's not afraid to speak his mind, and what he said wasn't even really this biting criticism of Tomlin. And what Kinkhabwala seems to imply is that there's all these players out here that have all these bad things to say about their experience working under Mike Tomlin. But the national media, she said the national media covers for him. Well, she's in the national media. Get my laptop there. It seems like every time we have something negative being said about Mike Tomlin, it's coming from her. So I think you have to consider the source a little bit about how valid it is.
Yeah, and I think wasn't there some kind of I don't want to get too much into this, but there was some kind of maybe hard feelings when she was covering the Steelers between her and Tomlin that I recall. So I don't know if that kind of colors some of her commentary there. Certainly it might, but I don't want to impugn her kind of journalistic integrity or whatever. But yeah, I think it's easy to kind of pile on with anonymous stuff when somebody like James Harrison says something and maybe she heard from, I mean, we know that there are some examples like a Melvin Ingram who was maybe promised to have a bigger role and then ended up, playing very few snaps in some games as the third outside linebacker and requested his way out of Pittsburgh in a trade they cut him. What did they do with him? He was gone. I think they just cut him. But there's been others. There's been other examples. I think James Harrison's a good one. Who else is a volunteer, not hostage example that there's been a couple others that are just escaping me. Oh yeah, LeGarrette Blount. Exactly. Yeah. He walked off the field, mid-game basically there. So yeah, I mean, how many players have complained about Tomlin? I mean, football's an emotional game, and I think, are there examples of players saying things? Probably. I mean, sure. Like, Tomlin's been around for 18, going on 19 years. I'm sure there's been stuff said. I mean, not every player's going to like him. How many players has Mike Tomlin even coached with the Steelers? I mean, it's got to be up in
a pretty ridiculous number.
Yeah, that's got to be in the above 500, 600, 700. I mean, the roster has turned over pretty significantly. The Steelers haven't been that stable over the last several years, so he's probably coached, closer to 1,000 than. Well, now I'm going to look into this after the show because I'm now curious how many players Tomlin has coached with Pittsburgh, but a lot, especially when considering offseason rosters. And so, yes, there's going to be guys who don't like his style. Not everybody's style is for every player, but I think Tomlin has been pretty good throughout his career at kind of giving players what they need. And I think just today, Ryan Clark was on Greenlight podcast with Chris Long and was talking about this very subject and basically said, there was never a time where he didn't feel prepared going into games. There was never a time where Tomlin didn't tell them exactly how they might win or lose. I think he said motivation was never an issue. And so, there's narratives that the Steelers play down to opponents and maybe motivation is an issue, but yeah, that might be one player's opinion. Ryan Clark's opinion, the opposite, and that's just how this thing works. So I don't buy too much into Aditi's thing here, but certainly it did make waves on our site. I think it's one of our top read articles of the week, if not the month, if not the last couple of months. So anything else that you wanted to touch on there before we move on to listener questions?
I think we covered that pretty well.
I think you had a shout out here for some listener of the show.
Just quick shout out to Mike Z from Freehold, New Jersey, recovering from hip surgery. Hope all goes well. We're rooting for you. Just hoping for a speedy recovery.
Yes, indeed. And you're about to have plenty of content coming your way. I don't know how long your recovery will last, but training camp is just around the corner, and you can pretty much be peeled to the site and have plenty of stuff to read if you so please. So we wish you the best, Mike Z, and thank you for watching the show. We're going to move into our listener question, and if you want a question answered, that's 412-254-3145. You can call and text, or you can leave a voicemail. Just tell us your name and where you're from so we can get to know some of you guys, some of you repeat question askers and listeners. This one is from Brett, one of our most frequent in San Angelo.
Hello, Depot Dive. This is Brett from San Angelo, and I'd like your thoughts on kind of an idea I had in going forward. Obviously, as you go through training camp and get to the end, a lot of times you see those trades where you trade people off in positions where you have excess, and obviously defensive line and punter and inside linebacker and cornerback are obvious positions where that could happen. Doesn't mean it will, but it could. My question or thought was, I think if they do trade people at the end of training camp, they should aim for 2027 draft picks. That's partially because you already have 12 2026, but also if you go into the draft and can't maneuver up to get a quarterback, you have 13, 14 picks in this year's draft, you may be in a position where you're ultimately drafting guys for another roster. On the other hand, a couple more picks in 2027, most of the time if you're trading for a quarterback, those aren't just, here's 6 picks in this year's draft. Those are usually several picks in this year's draft, several picks in next year's draft, sometimes even 3 years out. So having a couple more 2027, even if they're low round picks, might make it easier to facilitate a trade that involves multiple picks in multiple years. Just love to hear your thoughts, and you all have a good day.
All right, thank you for the question, Brett, and basically asking, should the Steelers start to shift their strategy towards maybe paying attention to 2027 draft picks if they trade some of these excess players, like he suggested, inside linebacker, cornerback, punter. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty solid idea just because of the volume of picks they're going to have in next year's draft. I just don't know if there's really going to be any demand for the players the Steelers could conceivably trade. Like, I don't think anybody's going to give up draft capital for like a Corliss Waitman. I'd be surprised if Mark Robinson fetched draft capital. So I just don't really know if there would be, a capacity for them to be able to get these picks for these players that they would conceivably look to ship off. But if they were able to, I do like the idea of getting the 2027 picks and, starting to build for that next year. Because if you have a quarterback, then the next year you can get them some receivers. Maybe you need offensive line help at that point. Maybe you need something else to help them out. So I do think that's a pretty solid idea. I just don't know how feasible it will be, given that I don't think the Steelers are going to have a ton of interest in the guys that would be the ones to be traded.
Yeah, I think the Steelers are probably more likely to be buyers than sellers. Maybe they can get like a seventh or something in return. But I mean, 2027 seventh is basically nothing. I mean, we're talking about value that's like next to zero value. And so, I mean, a seventh round pick already holds pretty little value, but if you're talking about in the future, yeah, not a huge needle mover either way. And I think the Steelers did a swap with the Pickens trade where they got the better end of the deal there, and then they did a swap with the most recent trade where they got the worse end of the deal. So is that kind of evened out more or less? Is that my understanding is correct?
Yep.
So 2027 is, unless I'm missing some random trade, which that I'm unaware of from a different trade there. I think 2027 is more or less just their normal slate of picks at the moment. So yeah, I mean, I like the idea, although I do think if they're going to package stuff up and go up for a quarterback next year, you're going to be getting rid of a bunch of draft capital, and you want to make sure you still have some. So is there really such a thing as too many draft picks? I think, some of these teams, I think in recent years we've seen have like an absurd number of draft picks. And yeah, I don't think all of those guys are going to make the roster, but if the Steelers are really planning on doing some moves, then I think, 12 could turn into 6, could turn into, or even 5 real quick. If you package some of those together and move up, or even if you move up multiple times, you move up to go in the first round, and then, there's a receiver you really want in the second or something, you can move up again because you have so many picks. And so 12 can turn into, 5, 6 pretty quickly. And so I think getting another 7th or getting another 6th in there, not going to hurt. I don't think you need to worry about overstocking on the draft picks. And they've shown that is their primary concern, is making sure that 2026 draft is well stocked. So I would not be surprised if they added another pick somewhere in the mix there. But again, I think that they could be buyers. I think maybe even at the trade deadline, if they have an injury at receiver or something, they could add, or whatever it might be. If the Steelers feel like they can upgrade with this roster, I think that they've kind of done a good job of going all in while also maintaining their 2026 mission. So, good question, Brett. And I hope you will. We know you will. You always do ask us questions, and we do appreciate those. But we hope some of the rest of you will call in, 412-254-3145. Again, you can text that, or you can leave us a voicemail. Just let us know your name, where you're from, give us a brief question, and we will answer it on a future episode. We'll be back to our normal Tuesday, I believe, next week. We'll have to figure out a training camp schedule. I'm not exactly sure how that'll look yet. It gets quite hectic with Alex on site at training camp. Joe and I we had the podcast last year. I cannot remember what we did.
We did it we were doing pretty late, I remember, like 7, 8 o'clock on like Thursdays, but we can figure something out this year.
Yeah, we'll definitely figure it out. But until then, I am Ross. That is Joe. This was the Depot Dive, and we will catch you guys next time.